the Associate Director at POLIS. I lead the Water Project. My background is in law, economics, public policy, restoration of natural sciences, so a hodgepodge. But one of the things we do at POLIS is fairly regularly, sort of every quarter or so, convene a discussion series. Sometimes they're smaller, sometimes they're larger, and sometimes we do a big public event. This is one of the nicely in the middle packages, and again, they work because people come out and are ready to engage. The purpose of the discussion series is to explore these key aspects or emerging issues related to ecological governance, and I'll talk just a bit about that. But today's focus is going to be a bit more on the collaborative watershed governance component. So it marries my two interests, obviously ecological governance and the water file marries nicely, as we know in this province, and many of us in our various capacities are dealing with significant change as it relates to water and importantly governance. So in many ways a very timely topic. Also, when we think about sort of the issues of the day, whether we talk about food security, water energy nexus, sustainability, economic prosperity, watershed function, all these aspects all together are implicated by water and watersheds. And importantly, the way we make collective decisions about these entities is where the governance piece comes in, so very important. So the format for today will be as you have already sensed, doing a little bit of the introductory type comment, and then we'll have our two guest speakers. First, Alice Cohen, and I'll do some formal introductions, and Neil will be speaking about different aspects. In particular, Alice will be talking about sort of the Canadian scene. She's doing some work looking at the Canadian view, sort of outside BC, so we can see some trends there. And Neil Deans will offer us some comments and some really valuable insight from New Zealand, where they've gone through a number of changes, and there's some very interesting parallels, also some interesting differences. So the structured part of the conversation will probably be about 20 minutes to half an hour each, with some room for what I would call focused questions. So if they said something or they showed you something on a slide that you're particularly wondering about, we'll have a chance to answer those pressing questions. But then once they both have sort of set the frame a little bit, we're going to hopefully move into more of a discussion style, hence the somewhat rectangular round table, that we can talk hopefully with each other and with our guests in a more sort of exploratory way about some of these issues as it interests us. So, that's a sense of the ground rules. I'll obviously moderate, but I know you'll all be very good and I won't have to hardly moderate at all. So again, the POLIS Project on Ecological Governance is a research center here at the University of Victoria, established in 2000 by the Eco Research Chair in Environmental Law and Policy. It's really the space where academic and policy research on sustainability meets community action and engagement. So we have this interesting blend or hybrid approach where we both do applied and theoretical research, but also blend it with action and sort of change on the ground. And I think that's really probably, if I'm going to guess, I know most of the faces in the audience, that's what really interests us, that mix. This isn't just about theory, but it isn't just about practice. We want to blend them both in a really thoughtful way. I think an important quote, at least a quote that I have used to help provide that focus in the Water Project is, in a healthy society, economy always follows ecology and education precedes them both. And this kind of event exactly fits in that mix. So I think that's important. As we all know, governance is an important aspect when we think about collective decision making. It's about the who, the what, and the how. Issues of accountability are obviously critical. And it really is about constitution of power, who has the influence and what are the implications of the jurisdictions to deal with these issues. Ecological governance takes this in a very focused way because it talks about the environment in all levels of decision making. It's not just about some sort of lifestyle choice, like what kind of toilet paper you might buy at the grocery mart, but thinking about functioning systems as the underpinning to all that we do, both culturally, socially, and economically. It really emphasizes environment not as an add-on, but central to how we will make these decisions. And it asks how we might foster circular systems, so reducing demand on distant and even local ecosystems. So the fundamental question that we're all trying to answer is, what does governance shaped by the principle of ecological sustainability look like? And the sort of the disappointing, but also the optimistic part of that is we don't know. There aren't any clear examples. Like many of these challenges, we are just learning. We're in the processes of this exploration, and that's part of the benefit of, and that's why the title really matters, the POLIS Project. It's not the POLIS answers, it's not the POLIS solutions, it's the POLIS Project, because we're experimenting and working through some of these challenges. And that really emphasizes when we talk about ecological function and ecological units, we're talking about things like uncertainty and things like resilience being critically important. So how do we build those institutions that also develop those aspects like social resilience and social integrity that will, in a sense, then protect that ecological function. Just a few quick additional remarks about ecological governance. I'm not going to spend a lot of time discussing that in detail because in a way we're going to explore them via some of the specific examples that our guest speakers will be providing, but I'm going to tell you a bit of what it's not. So ecological governance is not one size fits all. Instead, it must evolve in place. So what we're going to learn is in different places, its permutations or its applicability changes and manifests in very different and surprising ways. But it's important that we look at it from a principled approach. What are the core principles? What is it that we can learn? What are the valuable lessons that we don't need to recreate some of the wrong paths? So another thing that ecological governance is not is neat and tidy models. Nothing in nature is neat and tidy. Instead, it is messy and complex. Sometimes difficult or challenging problems means difficult or challenging governance. That's the compliment. If somebody wants to sell you the easy, one-size-fits-all, easy solutions, be cautious. And finally, the idea that applicable to, ecological governance is not applicable to individual sectors or industries, that it in effect permeates many aspects. And that's the excitement, I think, of the Water Project, because as we know, water is implicated in so many aspects of what we do and what we think about, whether we think about, like I said, food security or energy or issues of decision making. Water is really interesting because from a civil society perspective, it's one of the few natural aspects or natural commodities that can really rally the troops, as it were. People get behind it and are very concerned about water issues, and we see lots and lots of evidence of that. And finally, I just want to emphasize that from the Water Project perspective, we recognize that the sustainability conundrum really is a social, not a technical challenge. So we're talking about ultimately requiring changing behavior and the commitments to innovation that needs to come with it, the idea that local solutions must develop in place, that we're talking about a time scale that may not be as comfortable politically. It's longer than the 2 to 4 year kind of political cycle, and that structures of power and processes for decision making really matter. It requires this attention to governance to enable this innovation to happen. So with that as a bit of the backdrop, and welcome, jump on in, I'm going to introduce Alice Cohen, who is a doctoral candidate in Resource and Management Environmental Studies program at the Institute for Resource, Environment and Sustainability at UBC. The mouthful, I've been practicing, it's okay. Her current research focuses on watershed scale governance models. Specifically, her research is concerned with the ways in which these models are taken up and implemented, as well as the practical and conceptual implications of that uptake. Alice and I are also, with the broader water team, working on some additional research materials and hopefully a nice detailed report and complementary pieces around watershed governance and the experiences from different jurisdictions and what the implications are for Canada moving forward. So with that, Alice, why don't you share some of your research and thinking?
Great, thanks. Hi, so thanks for coming, and I'm really excited to have a chance to talk about the policy implications of my research because I've spent quite a bit of time in the academic theory, which is really interesting and exciting in its own right, but I think that what I'm doing, or I hope that what I'm doing, has some really interesting and exciting policy aspects as well. So I'll do my presentation, but I'm really excited to have feedback from you guys and to hear a little bit more about what you think about these kinds of questions. So I can click to the next slide. Okay, I'm sure everyone knows what this is already, but a watershed is an area of land draining into a common body of water. This is a map from Natural Resources Canada. There's a few things about this definition that I think are really interesting and are just worth bearing in mind as I go through the presentation. The first thing is that an area of land draining into a common body of water doesn't specify a size. So there are as one of the people I interviewed said, that could be a sidewalk puddle. Yes, it could also be, Prince Edward Island has 30 watersheds. It could be the Great Lakes Basin. It could be the Hudson Bay Drainage Basin. One person said it could be the whole world. So this doesn't specify a size, and the question about where you draw that boundary is still a really interesting issue. So the other thing about this picture is that it doesn't have any people in it. So this is the definition we often have. This is the image we often have of like the water cycle. There are no people and no animals in this picture, and I think that's particularly interesting because that's not how it is in most of the real world. So when we think about watersheds, we can also think about the way that they've been defined by how people have acted in them. When I was in Alberta, there are a number of watersheds that are partially structured by irrigation, by irrigation flow, and that really moves water in and out of watersheds. How does that factor into our definition? So these are all things to keep in mind when you talk about what watersheds actually look like. So, next. So here is a very simplified sort of hierarchy of different levels of government in Canada. And what's interesting about watersheds, if you click on the next one, is that they kind of cut across all of them. So the size of watersheds that I'm going to be talking about that probably most of you are familiar with are these things that are generally smaller than provinces but bigger than municipalities. But what's interesting is that they cut across the boundaries of all of them. So you could have a really small watershed, that, like the Abbotsford Sumas Aquifer, that crosses the Canada-US border. Or you could have a really big watershed, like in some of the big watersheds in some of the provinces that stay within a province. And so the size is sort of a different question from whether or not it straddles international boundaries, which makes it kind of a fuzzy, weird thing to work with. But when I talk about the watershed approach, I'm talking about this use of hydrologic boundaries, whichever of those boundaries I'm talking about, as the basis for planning and management. It also often, but not always, comes with increased non-governmental or extra-governmental participation, and some degree, and there's a really broad spectrum, of delegation to a watershed-scale group. And all of those parts are things I'm going to talk about, but when we talk about a watershed-based approach, this is typically what people think of. And you get these really interesting definitions of watersheds, like the US EPA defines a watershed as a participatory unit, which is quite interesting from a hydrologic perspective. So there's all kinds of different ways that people are seeing these things, and it's not as cut and dry as, well, it's just topography. So sometimes it's that simple, but not all the time. So before I get into some of the research questions, I just have I'll go to the next slide to just show, so watersheds, there's going to be a lot of clicking in this slide. It's not a new idea. This is something that's been happening all over the world for quite some time. Neil will talk about it, in New Zealand. It's been going on since the 1970s. But in Canada, it is relatively recent. So if you click on the first slide, so this is Canada in 1946. The only Canadian jurisdiction that had used watersheds at a provincial scale, that had a provincial framework for watersheds, was Ontario through the Conservation Authorities Act in 1946. So if we click to the next slide, in 2002, you can see in Eastern Canada, things moving right along, Quebec, Prince Edward Island, New Brunswick, and if you click again, in last year, you've got most of the country. Nova Scotia's new water, this is a slightly older map, Nova Scotia has a new water policy that came out in 2010. They haven't gone the watershed direction, but this is sort of what things are looking like right now. I know it's an ongoing conversation in BC. And as I say, Canada's not the only place. The mid-90s and early 2000s seem to be a particularly popular time with the European Water Framework Directive, for example, and a number of watershed-scale organizations in the United States. So I'm particularly interested in why this happened and why we're going this way. So the next thing I did was to look, so this is just talking about the Canadian situation. So this is still some of the background information. So if you click again, so a province-wide framework, 7 of the 13 provinces have a province-wide water policy, and of those, 7 of them have incorporated watersheds into that policy. So saying, as a province, we're going to carve, like Alberta, some of you might be familiar with Water for Life, we're going to carve the province up into X number of watersheds, and we're going to govern water on that basis. But of those 7, so you can click to the next one, 5 of them have it in legislation. So sometimes it's legislatively based, sometimes it's not. So Prince Edward Island, for example, doesn't have watershed legislation, but they've reorganized their Ministry of Environment to line up with watershed organizations. And then some provinces have one or multiple pieces of legislation to support that kind of change. The mandates, really vary from allocation, which is pretty substantial, to stewardship, which is more about public education and getting the community out and doing stream cleanups and these kinds of things. So what these organizations are charged with doing really varies from province to province. And even within a province, depending on the capacity, the scope of activities really varies. The next part about participation, I think, is really interesting. So in 5 of these provinces, you are required to have public participation. Either it's legislated, or it's a condition of getting funding. And sometimes legislation can be really, really specific. So in Quebec, for example, it says, on your watershed committee, you need to have one person who does this, one person from this sector, 3 people from this sector, 6 people from this sector. It's really specific. In some of the other ones, it just says you need to have some public participation. So that varies, but it's interesting to note what they mean by that, and that sometimes it's legally required and sometimes not. And then the funding arrangements really differed. Some provinces had startup funding for watershed groups, and then some provinces had sustained ongoing funding. So the next slide is just a list of some examples of provincial water policies, and I suspect people are probably pretty familiar with that, so I won't spend too much time on them. This is this old map again. So I went and took all that information about the legislation and the participation, and I went to 4 different Canadian provinces, Ontario, Alberta, New Brunswick, and Nova Scotia. And I chose these 4 because they're geographically diverse, but what's also interesting is that they're in different stages of the process of using watersheds. So in Ontario, they're quite familiar with this process, but I couldn't talk to the people who had made the decision in 1946. So they were my experienced group, but I couldn't talk to any decision makers. In Alberta, they implemented Water for Life in 2003, and I was able to speak there with some people who have been involved in that decision, and that's something that people have been working with for quite a number of years. And then in New Brunswick, they will very proudly tell you that they were the first province in Canada to have, or the only province in Canada to have source-to-tap watershed protection before Walkerton. Well, they were. And they also have community-based watershed processes. And then Nova Scotia, as I mentioned, was in the process of developing a province-wide water policy. So it was interesting to talk to a group of people who are grappling with exactly these kinds of questions. I have a couple of slides here on my dissertation, which probably won't be, I'll kind of zoom through them. Basically, there are 3 papers coming out of it. You can click through them. The one I'm going to be talking about today, if you click again, there's a little red circle. This is basically the paper that I think is most interesting for today. And it has the most interesting policy applications, but it focuses on understanding why watersheds have become so popular in Canada. And I think that, as I'll get into, when you understand why this shift happens, it sheds a little bit more light on what it means to take on this kind of strategy, if you can understand why it happened in the first place. And getting to this question was a really interesting story. If I click to the next slide, click. So there's this widespread uptake, and then if you click again, so my question was, okay, well, I'm going to see if this has been effective. I'm going to see if they've met their goals. And then if you go back one more, I thought, okay, well, to see if they've met their goals, you need to look at why they did this change, and then you can measure whether or not they've met their goals. But what was really interesting was when I started reading all these Canadian policies, they had sentences in them like, it is widely acknowledged that watersheds are the best scale for water governance, and so that's what we're going to use. Or, best practices recognize that this is what we're going to do. And there were never really any explicit reasons for why we were doing this other than everyone says we should. So then that became the research question, because it's kind of hard to know how well you're doing if you don't know why you went there in the first place. So when I went out and talked to people, it came out that there were really 4 reasons for doing it. And the first one, you can click down, is really the most obvious, and this is by far the most common thing. And everyone said, well, it's obvious, they're nature's boundaries. It's not rocket science. Everything drains into a common body of water. if you click, there's a quote from the Conference Board of Canada, but there are many, many quotes like this where people just say watershed is the natural unit. It just makes sense. It's topography. So that was by far the most common one, although that's not really super explicit in many of the provincial policies, and this is something we could talk about later, but I wonder if it's partly because of this watershed definition issue that I brought up at the beginning, but we can come back to that. The second point is integration and IWRM, which Integrated Water Resource Management, very popular. So the quote for this one, if you click, this is talking about the IJC, which is the International Joint Commission that governs water between Canada and the United States. So someone was saying, around 2000 or so, the IJC decided that there was more than one board in place, a water quality board and a water quantity board. They wanted to merge them, and that is watershed governance. So that's another version of it, and that you integrate. And what's interesting is when you talk to people, there's lots of different ideas about what we're integrating. So are we integrating land and water, humans and nature, quantity and quality, air and water, water in the economy. So there are lots of things to integrate, and that was very rarely made explicit. The third thing is that watersheds are more participatory than other governance units. This is the other thing you hear. So that if we use watersheds as governance scales, this will help us get more public participation, which is a really important goal. And here's another quote. So this is, I believe, in Alberta. Yeah, so someone was saying, before the province would set up a planning process and consult with the public at various points, and then they would build a plan based on that information. But now the new approach is that Albertans participate in it, so that when you're developing a plan, you have everyone around the table building it. And this is very much this idea that watersheds are sort of an avenue or a venue for people to come together and work together on common problems as a community. And then the fourth point is decentralization, and this is one quote, but there are many people who say things along the line, is that the bottom line is that you really need to work at the lowest possible scale. And this is this idea that there's no cookie cutter solution and that people on the ground have the best expertise. What's interesting about this particular thing is that when you talk with people at municipalities, they don't always see it as a decentralization. Often they're being asked to work with the other municipality down the road that they maybe didn't have to work with before. So in a way it's decentralization, but in a way it's a centralization. But that second half of the conversation doesn't seem to have gotten as much attention and discussion, which is interesting. So when you introduce these kinds of scales with these rationales, you get a number of tensions, and this gets into the project that Oliver and I are working on together. And there's been a bunch of work done academically, especially on the challenges associated with watershed scale governance. I'm sure some of you are familiar with it. There's this famous Blomquist and Schlager paper, but people say, well, it's hard to have accountability at a watershed scale. Watersheds and airsheds or groundwater don't always align, so there's lots of sort of challenges. But what struck me when I was going across Canada is that, well, there's challenges associated, and that's true, but there's also a number of tensions. So two really good and important ideas that when you introduce watersheds seem to kind of pull at each other in an interesting way. So that's maybe what I'm hoping we can get into a bit of conversation about afterwards. So the first one is ecologically meaningful scales and drinking water protection. So as I mentioned earlier, one of the drivers behind watersheds was this idea to use nature's scales and to work within an ecosystem paradigm. And that's a really important and interesting goal. In a completely other separate, and sometimes a whole other branch of government, you have drinking water protection, which is a huge and important public health issue. And these two things don't necessarily always go together, right? So often a drinking water intake zone will be smaller than an entire watershed, right? Or a municipality will get its drinking water from somewhere that's further away and not actually technically in the watershed that they're in. And so you have this interesting back and forth between those two that I think is something really worth exploring. And I would suggest maybe, anyway, when push comes to shove, drinking water has tended to get the emphasis, and that's a good thing because it's important that humans be healthy and drinking water be safe. But I think it's important to keep in mind when we're thinking about moving towards watersheds that isn't necessarily the same thing as an ecological scale, not all the time. The second sort of tension that I've listed is the difference between clarity and flexibility. So pretty much everywhere, it's on chuckle, I think. Yeah. So these are both really important things, again, right? It's important to have a clear mandate or a clear set of goals that you're asking these groups to reach. And this is something that I heard across the country from nearly everyone. What's our mandate? The province hasn't said, we want watersheds to do A and B and C. What are we supposed to be doing? And then at the same time, we're having the conversation about how local, we need to have locally appropriate things. We need to have local knowledge influencing policy. And so these two things can kind of rub up against each other too, because how do you come up with a mandate? In a case like BC, we've got, desert and rainforest, and how do you come up with something that's going to work everywhere and that takes local adaptation into consideration? One person in Ontario, I think, framed this a really good way, talking about the source water protection committees, if any of you are familiar with them. And he was saying, the goal of them is consistency, not uniformity. And I thought that was a really interesting way of framing it. But then you get into an exercise about defining sort of what you're trying to be consistent on, which gets back to the rationale. So this is sort of another push-pull tension that came out. So the next one is tension between watershed plans and land use planning, and this is probably something that a lot of you are also familiar with. But this is this idea that, all right, well, if watersheds, are an area of land draining into a common body of water, then it would make sense that in watershed planning, we have some provisions for what you can and cannot do on the land within that particular watershed. And that sort of bumps up against some of the land use planning processes that we see in various places. So one obvious example was in Alberta. So Alberta, through Water for Life, has established the WPACs, which are the Watershed Planning and Advisory Councils. They're based on a watershed scale. They do all kinds of public outreach, but they also do reporting, state of the basin reports, and this kind of stuff. In a completely separate process, in another ministry, in what sometimes feels like a galaxy far, far away, there's the Alberta Land Stewardship Act. And it's relatively new. It's quite clear that it's going to become the number one piece of planning legislation in the province. They are divided into RACs, which is a regional advisory councils. Everyone on the Regional Advisory Council is appointed by the Government of Alberta. The negotiations happen behind closed doors. They need to take economic, social, and environmental factors into account, and they don't always line up with watershed boundaries. So this is really interesting. How do these two things come together? And there's a lot of frustration and questions that come up along this. Another interesting example is New Brunswick. They realized this tension, and they did something really interesting to my mind. So most provinces have a piece of legislation, usually called something like the Municipal and Communities Act or something, that says that municipalities and towns need to come up with official community plans at regular intervals, and they submit these plans to the province and they get approved. What they realized was happening was that process for them was happening in, I'm going to get the name wrong, but something like the Department of Municipal Affairs, and that the Department of Municipal Affairs had nothing to do with the Department of Environment, that they were two separate things. So they moved that piece of community planning legislation is now in the Department of Environment. So to have your community plan approved, it's the Department of Environment who approves it, not the Ministry of Community Planning anymore. So that's one way that they've gotten around that. But it's an ongoing tension and something that's quite interesting for me anyway. And then the fourth one, okay, that's good, I'm on my last slide, is watersheds and policy sheds. So this is this idea, it comes up all the time, Oliver was saying it earlier, that watersheds don't really line up with policy boundaries. What's interesting though is that as we give watershed groups increasing amounts of authority, they kind of become policy boundaries too, right? So how do we draw that boundary? How do they intersect with other levels of government? So right now at watershed groups you'll have representatives from other levels of government sitting on the watershed councils, but you don't necessarily have watershed people sitting on the other level of government councils. And so how that whole relationship happens is another tension that I've identified in there. So I just have a couple more slides because I got my 5-minute warning. So this is my so what slide. If you click, this is my road, my metaphor. But if we're going down this road towards increased watershed-based governance, there are a couple of questions that I think we really need to stop and ask. Measuring effectiveness. So when are they appropriate or useful? And I think the answer to this question really hinges on why we're going in that direction in the first place. And I think that watersheds are appropriate and useful, but we really need to think about why we think that and make that really explicit and have some way of monitoring whether we're meeting our goals. And then the second question is thinking critically about hard questions, what to prioritize. When we have these tensions that I was just talking about, how do you wrestle through that? Who do you involve in that conversation? So those are things I think we really need to be consciously thinking about when we think about these policy choices. And then the last slide is a really messy, ugly table. But I think part of the problem is that we're conflating 3 different things. So we have these goals, and then we have ways of getting there, and then we have ways of measuring them, and they're all kind of like jumbled up. And sometimes they are in the real world too, and I get that. But so for example, we talk about, well, watersheds are more participatory. Okay, well, is participation the goal? Because that's good. Or is it a way of getting somewhere else? And the thing that people never seem to make really explicit, like, what is the ultimate goal of this? And what no one ever said is improved water quality. So maybe that's not a goal, right? Maybe this is all about participation and integration, or the integration of what. So this is just kind of like a brain dump that we can talk about later. But, like, is it worth trying to think about these 3 things as separate and what's what? And maybe these are some things we can think about when moving forward. So I think that's it. Thanks.
Well, we will thank Alice for a very nice.
But I guess in terms of this conversation, and we've just been hearing a bit about watershed management, in 1941 a piece of legislation established catchment boards, as we call it. Depends whether you're trying to get rid of water or keep it, I guess, whether you call them catchments or not. But that established catchment-based management. So we've had that in New Zealand for 70 years. And the focus initially was on managing flood control and on soil conservation, because we're geologically a young country. There's a huge amount of erosion, and there was a lot of concern at that stage that we were losing our soils, so that's a fair bit to do with it. In the 1960s, there was a lot of concern about point source pollution, and that led to the development of the Water and Soil Conservation Act, which was largely addressed at water quality. So we're dealing with water quantity, and then with water quality, not so much water quantity on the shortage side, the abundance of it. And under the Water and Soil Act, they brought in water quality classification, at least they tried to do so. Now, this was all reviewed in a major way in the late 1980s, and in fact, both administration and legislation was changed in a dramatic way at that time. So move on to the next one, and that brought in our Resource Management Act. Now, that tried to integrate all of resource management in one piece of legislation. It replaced 50 pieces of earlier legislation, including those I've referred to, but including the Town and Country Planning Act, so also land use planning, air planning. It received in the end considerable cross-party support from a wide variety, a hugely extensive consultation process to develop it. It took about 4 years to enact. And the purpose of it is the integrated management of natural, that's all natural and physical resources, lands, waters, coasts, air. There was a move at that time away from managing activities, that is a sawmill or a farm, and towards the effects of that activity. So is there some air quality issue arising from the mill or whatever? It's a nice idea in theory. It's been rather more difficult to achieve in practice. Another aspect to it was the extent of public participation. That was an aspect which was grounded early. And also that this concept of subsidiarity, of making decisions, and we've already heard about that, that one should try as much as possible to plan at the local level. Again, that's been an interesting experiment. Move on. So look, I don't want you to attend to this in detail, except to say this is taken straight out of the purpose, section 5 of the Act, and it is to promote the sustainable management of natural and physical resources, And that's what that means. I'll leave that with you. You might wish to reflect on it for those of you involved in this. There's been a lot of case law about this going up to our highest courts, what this actually means. And given that it's covering a great range of resources, it actually has different implications, for example, for land use planning, which is privately owned, as opposed to other resources like water, which is in public management. And that has quite a different tension. But we are supposed to be managing the use, development and protection at a rate which allows people to enjoy those things while sustaining future potential, life supporting capacity and avoiding adverse effects. It's quite a mouthful and it takes a lot of getting your head around what all of that means. And just very briefly, I'll just touch on these. In relation to the water issue, it's followed by a couple of sections in the legislation addressing itself to matters of national importance. And you'll see, and I've highlighted and underlined the bits relating to water. Wetlands, lakes and rivers of their margins are to be preserved and protected from inappropriate subdivision use and development. Protection of areas of significant indigenous vegetation, significant habitats of indigenous fauna. Public access to waterways, and the relationship of Maori to their culture and traditions with ancestral waters as well as lands and other things. So there's quite a lot in there that is supposed to be protected under this legislation. Hasn't always worked out like that. Next one, please. There are also some other matters, and I won't go into detail here, but these include things like intrinsic values, amenity values, environmental quality. These are all things which decision makers are supposed to be taking into account. The trouble is there's a whole long list of them, including, for example, sustainable renewable energy, which sometimes might come into conflict with, say, amenity values or intrinsic values. So an interesting question for decision makers as to how they weigh out what should be given regard or had regard to. Next, please. So who administers this legislation, this great, enormous piece of multifaceted? Interestingly, it's been pushed right out to our local level, and only a very small policy group from Wellington, from our central government. Bear in mind we don't have a federal government, but the Ministry for the Environment in Wellington actually has very little to do except provide policy oversight here. The administration of it is at the local authority level, so the equivalent of your municipalities or regional districts, which is a bit of a scary thought perhaps for you, and it certainly is for me, even now. It is effectively a planning act, and there is provision for national instruments to identify objectives and policies at a planning level, and also bring in standards. But central government has opted not to do that. So that's a tension which I'll return to later, because what we've had is a great deal of wheel reinvention around the country as to how one should go about this, because effectively it is enabling legislation. It's not prescriptive. So you can come up with a way of doing it or not, as you see fit. There are also things called water conservation orders, and I'll touch on those briefly, which are to do with nationally significant waterways. So we have across the country 16 catchment-based regional authorities which administer and make decisions in respect of water, and I'm talking mainly about water in this context. Land use management is the territorial local authorities, of which there are, I think, some 89 across the country. Thanks. So one of the questions which has arisen here is that there has been no Crown appropriation of water in New Zealand. The management of water has been de facto assumed by the Crown, but there was never agreement in the treaty relationship with Maori that water management was made over to the Crown. So the Crown has decided to give it to regional councils to administer very kindly. The regional councils in themselves are not the Crown, and so Maori are trying to re-establish a relationship with the Crown through the treaty, and they are dealing in respect of water management with a party that is not the Crown. So we have a very interesting constitutional conundrum which has arisen as a result of that. And so right now we're having a lot of debate about how can Maori get involved in decision making at a regional council level. And that's being debated at some length across the country at the moment. I'll just throw that up as an idea. Of course, Te Māori, and this appears to be the case from my very limited understanding with the First Nations people here, is that water is extremely important to them. In fact, the question, if you go and ask a Māori person, who are you, what is your name, the phrase, ko wai taku uma, is what is your name? It literally means from what water do you come? So it is fundamental to their cultural perception. When they identify themselves as a person, they identify their mountain, where they come from, and their river. So it's also a very important source of food, not dissimilar to the source of food of salmon and the culture of local people here. So that's an interesting similarity I think we have with you here, particularly here in British Columbia. Thanks. Now, just turning a wee bit to how this plays out. I mentioned briefly that land uses, under the legislation, I mentioned before that you're supposed to be addressing yourself to the effects of activities, not the activities themselves. And of course, land is privately owned, and owners under the legislation are allowed to do whatever they like unless a district plan has constrained the use of the land, the use of by way of subdivision or anything else. That means the plans have to include everything that you may wish to constrain. In respect of water, and this applies to the coasts and air as well, the presumption is reversed. You're not allowed to do anything in respect of water, with a couple of minor exceptions to do with firefighting and domestic water supply, unless you receive a consent from the regional council, or the regional council writes a plan with a rule in it that enables you to do it without consent. So that presumption is reversed. Now that means that there's a lot more activity going on by regional councils in respect of water. The decision maker is an elected regional council. So these are elected at large at the time of local authority elections. And they decide on whether there should be plans, what they should say, and what goes on with consent applications. But there is public participation in those processes to a greater or lesser extent. Thanks. Now, one of the issues which has arisen is that plans can establish whether you can undertake the activity as of right, it's a permitted activity, right through to the other extreme, they may prohibit certain activities. For example, in the water space, it's very rare for activities to be prohibited, but it may be that because of the importance of a river for the movement of fish up and down, fish passage, you may decide to prohibit a dam. So that's the kind of thing that may happen or may not. And you've got everything in between, permitted, controlled, discretionary, non-complying to prohibited. And every activity can be defined in this way. And so there's a great deal of control about, or the extent to which control is exercised by decision makers over activities. Now, one of the fundamental aspects is public participation, and both the presumption is in favour of public involvement. Now, this has proven to be a headache in practice because sometimes public involvement, in fact, can be very delaying of process, and sometimes without useful effect. On the other hand, the risk is, and increasingly we're finding decisions being made without public notification. We've found all sorts of clever ways of getting around the law to avoid that. So this is a point of tension, and the Resource Management Act, if you ask members of the public what it's about the ability of my neighbour to stop me being able to add a carport onto the side of my house. That's what most people perceive the Resource Management Act to be now. They hear horror stories about it, and there are some horror stories, but in fact, when it comes to water management, most people don't pay much attention to the fact that it's constraining the use of a publicly managed resource. So how you, or whether you notify, becomes a key issue, because the transaction costs of having to notify the costs go up tenfold sometimes as a result of that. And in some cases, objectives can be vexatious and cause difficulties for what may be perfectly legitimate applications. However, in the water space, in some cases, and I use an example of Canterbury in the South Island, a region which is the largest region in the country, where fewer than 20 water consents were turned down over about a 10-year period out of 7,000 applications. So who's winning here? This is applications to take water for private use, for irrigation and the like. The RMA is a planning act, but rather curiously, it is a requirement to have district plans. Those are the ones that constrain land use. But regional plans, which are at a higher level and are binding on district plans, are not required. If you don't have them, you have problems in water management, which I'll get to in a minute. But what you can have in these plans are catchment or multi-catchment basis, or quite localised. They can set water quality standards. They can set river flow regimes, quite sophisticated in some cases, water levels of lakes. They can integrate surface and groundwater management, and they can attempt, although this has been rarely exercised because of the politics involved, control effects of land use, particularly land use intensification on waterways, which is an issue throughout the world, a difficult issue to address. Are they a panacea? Well, as I mentioned, they're discretionary. And if you don't have limits, or plans should I say, there are no limits. So the issues that have arisen, particularly in places like Canterbury, water-short regions, is that without limits, they just keep on issuing more and more consents. There's less and less water available, and some rivers have dried up as a result. And particularly cumulative effects cannot be addressed in the absence of setting limits which everyone is bound to. So the other issue is that regional councils and many decision makers actually are very reluctant to fetter their own discretion. So often they are unwilling to set rigorous standards or limits. And this is an issue which I'll come back to later. There's also a question about the extent to which that may constrain private property rights. And we have great debate about land versus water use and the implications of that. For example, the forestry sector, we all know that forests can reduce catchment runoff in water-short areas, and should that enable a catchment authority or a regional council to restrict afforestation in order to maintain flows in rivers because they've over-allocated the water downstream. And we had a very celebrated environmental law case on that. Also, unfortunately, we really need long-term focus for these plans, at least 10 years. They're supposed to exist for 10 years. Short-term focus of politicians is really more than 3 years, as everybody knows. Next one, please. I touched on water conservation orders. These are a slightly odd thing that go back, predating the legislation. They were identified when there was a thing called the National Development Act, which was about developing resources, large-scale hydro in the national interest. They decided that we needed something to balance that, and this was something equivalent to national park status, where if something was outstanding, it could be protected, and to recognise and sustain outstanding amenity in either the natural state or in a modified state. And these can be applied for a bit like a consent application on a large scale, and then you may be able to put in high water quality standards or prevent dams and those sorts of things. And my organisation has been involved in applying for a number of these. Just a bit more about conservation orders. These are the sorts of things for which you can apply as a fishery, for wildlife habitat, for Maori cultural values, etc. Now, that's not to say that we don't have water issues. We certainly do. And I guess the big three are further hydroelectric power development. A bit like you here in Canada, we have somewhere between 60 and 70% of our electricity is generated by hydro, and there's a lot of proposals for more. We also have issues about land use effects, diffuse source pollution, and we have issues about over-allocation of water or leaving insufficient water in stream or in lakes. There's also some regional council, frankly, isn't up to the task and hasn't got the resources available to it to deliver these outcomes. They've been given a big job by central government with no resources. And the transaction costs, particularly as water becomes scarce, have increased dramatically. So that's been a problem. But certainly we have had a huge increase in the amount of irrigation, for example, in the last 10 years, a more than 50% increase. So it has enabled use, but we've got to the end of that. There's no much more water available, certainly not on a run-of-river basis anyway. Thanks. In recognition of some of these problems, we have, many of us at the national level have been trying to develop national policy instruments to provide guidance to regional councils from the centre. And frankly, this process has been stalled for all sorts of reasons of bureaucratic incompetence and political unwillingness. And of course, during which time there's been further exploitation of the water resource. So we all know who benefits from no action in this case. What has happened is that all parties involved, all the stakeholders, have realised that this has been not a good outcome, because what we've had is wheel reinvention all over the country, different shaped wheels, different policies, different approaches, when in fact there could be a commonality of approach and different application of that common approach. Interestingly, because the policy statement has been stalled, the stakeholders themselves have engaged directly and put to our central government that we should engage in a process through a collaborative governance process to try and come up with some recommendations to be implemented at a national level. And effectively we've done this despite rather than because of government. We had a change of government about 18 months, 2 years ago. They were persuaded to allow this thing to proceed. And I've been involved as one of 20 people trying to bang our heads together between environmental sector, industry groups, Maori groups and different parts of government to come up with some recommendations. And it's been challenging to say the least. The thing has just about fallen apart on a few occasions. On the other hand, if we are able to come up with recommendations sorted out between ourselves, there's little room for the decision maker, for government to say, actually this is a dumb idea, we actually would prefer to do something else. Their traditional response, of course, is to arbitrate between competing interests and pick a winner. In this case, the parties are saying to them, this is the outcome we can live with, how about you implement that and tell us where else you would get your mandate from. Next, please. You can look this up under the Land and Water Forum recommendations, and very broadly, these are the conclusions we arrived at. You do need to set hard limits and stick to them. Industry knows best how to achieve those limits, so let them get on with that in consultation with other parties. We've got ways to improve water allocation. We've effectively allocated most of the water that's available in most areas where it's water short, so we have to come up with more efficient ways of dealing with that. Obviously market mechanisms are a key way to look at that. And we also, where we've fully exploited our run-of-river water resource, we need to look at storage for improving water availability. I've just about got to the end of my presentation, and I've got some references here which you can take away. Actually, probably the most useful ones is the top and bottom one. My own stuff is a bit dated now, but I had quite an involvement in the top presentation, which is quite recently provided. Also, if you're interested in the processes we undertake, the bottom one from Forest and Bird, which is an environmental group, is quite a useful introduction to the RMA. So that's probably about all I have to say. There might be a summary slide as well. Okay. Yeah. So the Resource Management Act has been something of an experiment. When it came out, and I've spoken at a number of international conferences about the RMA, it was heralded as an innovative piece of legislation, quite comprehensive, and I guess we've now had 20 years of this experiment. And in many respects it's very good, but there are some bits in it which have to be included if you're going to get sound and integrated catchment management. And the thing I haven't really touched on here is that Oliver made passing mention of is the integrated catchment management research in the Marlborough catchment, which we've undertaken over the last 10 years. And that's looked at how communities can be enabled to come up with these sorts of solutions at a local level. And certainly I would advocate, and have been involved in several collaborative governance exercises at the local level, and it's a downside easier locally than it is at a national level, I can assure you. Where the competing interests struggle to get their heads around how they will interact with one another, let alone arrive at solutions. But we've achieved a great deal, and I would certainly commend that kind of process, even if it isn't easy, because the social capital you develop from engaging in those processes is hugely important to enabling solutions for a whole wide variety of other things going on as well. So perhaps I'll leave you with that.
Thank you.
I have one question with the Canterbury issue with over-allocated. Well, I'm assuming it's over-allocated.
Sure as hell is now, yes.
Okay. So, is there no authority to reject an application? Is that the problem?
Now, the problem fundamentally was because they had no regional plans in Canterbury, they had no limits set. And so, effectively, if you imagine taking a small amount of water from a large river, the effect of that, remember it's effect-based legislation, you had to show the effect of that on the fish population.
Right.
You can't show if you take, say, 100 litres a second out of a river flowing at 10 cubics, you simply can't measure. But if you have 1,000 of those takes, or even 100 of those takes, you've got no river left. So each individual one means nothing, but if you've set no limit, and if you set a limit that says, when we get to this point, sorry, no more, the next one in line, sorry, the answer is no. We'll prohibit that at this point. If they haven't set that plan in place, it can't be done. And there have been some cases where we've tried, and they simply say, sorry, we can't establish the effect of this individual take. It's the old straw on the camel's back stuff.
Okay, thanks. So there's not a cumulative limit then?
Yes, the regional plan can set that cumulative limit, but if there's no regional plan, you have to demonstrate in each individual case that that little bit more will be the straw that breaks the camel's back. Impossible to do ecologically. Yes?
How,
Sorry.
how inviolate are these regional plans?
Not very, sometimes. That is the reason that we use the word hard limits. That we are saying the Land and Water Forum has agreed that those limits need to be set. And the reason that industry agreed to that was acknowledging they need certainty too. It doesn't help them to have limits which aren't really limits. It just depends on how smart your lawyer is. If they're not, because if you set a limit, for example, to the amount of water that's taken as run of a river, and you stop at that limit, you may still have opportunities to augment water from somewhere else or to harvest it or whatever, and you go to that phase. Or possibly you go to a water market to try and improve the efficiency. But if you don't set the limit, everything becomes infinitely elastic and you finish up with the river drying up or the water quality declining.
I wanted to talk a bit about the catchment authorities. I was looking at Alice's first slide where she indicated that governance on a watershed basis cuts across federal, in our case, federal, provincial, and local levels of government. And I know, being an employee with the Ministry of Environment in BC, is that the biggest challenge for going to catchment authorities in BC is another multiplicity of governance. And we already have 4 levels of government, arguably 5, if you include First Nations. And the idea of bringing in a catchment authority, which is separate and over and above all the others, is intimidating. And I'll ask my friends Jennifer and others to comment on that if they so wish. But in New Zealand, from what I understand of your resource management, it's fundamentally based on the catchment authorities being the governance body. And so my 2 questions are, how do they relate to established municipal levels of government? Are they the same or are they different? And what's the accountability between them and the national government of New Zealand?
Well, in 25 words or less. You touch on a very important point. I mentioned in passing the review of environmental administration. That included local government review. So what we now have is the result of both change of legislation environmentally and also the administrative bodies at the same time across the whole country. And so there was a rather painful local government reorganisation at the same time, which now we look back on it and we think, well, how on earth could we have survived with the multiplicity of local authorities that we had prior to that? And we wouldn't contemplate going back. But of course at the time there was a huge vested interest in maintaining the status quo. I see that you may have that problem here, even from my brief experience of the number of municipalities I've crossed between here and the other side of town. And that the districts, the territorial councils are subdivisions of the regions. But there is a big problem that given that they are elected at the local level, most of the public perceive value in their local municipalities, if you like, in that they can see what they do. They put roads, they have libraries, they collect the rubbish, treat the sewage. But regional councils, what do they manage water, they manage air, they don't see what they do. So there is a probity problem in the sense that the electoral turnout to elect those officials is very low. It's only between 25-30%. So, for example, I think 1% of New Zealanders are farmers and 35% of our regional councillors are farmers. So there is a significant probity issue about who is in charge of these. And one of the questions that's arising, that's coming partly because of the Maori relationship with regional councils that I touched on, is the old catchment boards actually had appointed representatives as well as elected representatives. Now that's not necessarily a panacea, but it means at least that you have certain parties represented there as of right, and that question is being revisited at the moment. The other model that's being proposed is going a step further even than we've gone now, and that's to make what we call unitary councils, and to either subdivide or amalgamate those so that the council runs everything. So effectively you only have two, finish up in New Zealand's case with only two layers of government. So you have the local authority that does water management planning and land use planning, and central government does all the other stuff. And in my region, we actually have several unitary councils, and the new Auckland one is a unitary council. So we may finish up with that model, which takes one step up, but the problem comes back to the point I made earlier, that the difficulty is that politicians get elected on rubbish roads rates, not on good water management or good environmental management, which is a very different type of issue. So that then questions how they arrive, what sort of decision-making process they have. And one of the issues going through our minds at the moment is at what stage on a continuum are you between a decision-maker advising you what they're going to do, through consulting you, through to collaborative governance. There's a continuum there from minimal involvement of the public through to maximum involvement, and what stage on that process should you be? And that's a discussion we're really embarking on now. And it's a difficult one because having been involved in collaborative governance, it's a bit scary for the politicians because they effectively pass over decision-making recommendation power to these groups, which if they get them right, they've got no room to disagree with. Because if all the parties are engaged in that discussion and they arrive at a conclusion, where does the politician go? They can't decide, oh no, I'm going to do something else, because they've got no mandate to do it.
But the bottom line I'm hearing you is that in 1991 there was a transformative measure of governance. I mean, it wasn't just adding catchment areas to an existing governance structure, it was a complete change of the governance structure in New Zealand.
There was a degree of evolution. As I mentioned earlier, we had catchment management from the 1940s, so that wasn't new. But yes, it was transformative. And we have the luxury, if you want to call it that, of being able to make quite dramatic changes because of the short lines of communication between, or of governance, if you like, in our country, because we don't have a federal system, we have a single House of Parliament, those sorts of things. I mean, the Constitution, things can change, and sometimes do, violently from one extreme to the other. And that's why we've had this resource management experiment. And a lot of it's worked well, but there are some aspects of it have proven to be less effective. And I think it's useful for other countries to look at that and say, well, what worked, what didn't, and why. And we're not doing enough of that analysis ourselves, I would suggest, to help ourselves to improve our system. Sorry, I'm dominating.
No, that's good. I think it's really valuable. John also posed, I don't know if you guys wanted to, he sort of asked whether that level is intimidating. Do you want to comment from a government or from your perspective where you're seeing this process go through? Is this part of the real challenge? Is this adding another layer only makes it more complex versus solving problems?
I mean, we certainly, we've held 2 rounds of engagement with the public in British Columbia, and we're certainly hearing that there's no desire for a one-size-fits-all approach to governance in British Columbia. We're hearing from local governments, from regional districts and municipalities that they don't want to see any responsibilities downloaded to them. And if we do, where's the money? And so, I mean, all those traditional challenges with governance are there for us. Certainly there is space in British Columbia for watershed agencies or catchment basin councils. And so it's a matter of looking at the range of models that could be potentially possible and creating some conditions around the success of those should different agencies want to take those on. I think we'll probably see a statutory framework that is largely enabling so that we can actually do some of the stuff that Oliver's talking about around pilot projects so that we can succeed or fail and learn from those situations. The implementation side of it is really challenging, and it's something that, you know, we're looking for ideas on how to make it successful, because it's, you know, for us a lot of it boils down to resourcing and kind of where's the money going to come from to facilitate planning, facilitate these agencies. And so we are looking at the Conservation Authority model, looking at some of South Africa's legislation. They've got some really good stuff right in statute around catchment authorities. And so we're looking at the whole range of models to see how we can enable what's needed in different parts of British Columbia. The other side of that challenge